Hello, and Happy New Year's! Dead by Daylight has had a rough later half of 2022. Much of the player base is seemingly burnt out, and the meta feels more stale than ever. BHVR have been making lots of impactful alterations to perks and gameplay throughout the game's lifecycle, but it seems to have really ramped up in the last couple of years. Most recently, they have revealed a sneak peek of an assortment of user interface icons that are to be added to the Survivor experience. And this brings me to today's topic, which is looking at the balancing of solo queue gameplay to that of Survive with Friends. To fully discuss this topic, we're going to have to look back at the history of Dead by Daylight's gameplay, specifically when it was first released. We're going to reflect on the difference between the solo queue experience and that of a Survive with Friends, the evolution of balance within the game, explore what the new user interface could mean for the overall player experience, and ask you a very serious question: what is it you, as a player, actually want? As always, thank you for the support, and if you enjoy content like this, feel free to hit the subscribe button. Dead by Daylight went into public beta in May 2016, featuring the 3 original killers and the 4 classic survivors. The core loop remains the same as it did then as it does now. Survivors seek to repair generators, evade the killer, and escape the realm, or, if in the killer role, prevent generators from being repaired, hunt survivors down, and sacrifice them to the entity. Back then, there was a far more limited variety of perks to choose from, environments were darker, and the pace of gameplay was somewhat slower. Survivors had to rely more on stealth than maybe the more aggressive playstyles you see today. Rather than looping being an understood core component of gameplay, it was somewhat regarded as an exploit by some in the community. This was supported by poorly designed segments of the realms. An example of this is the classic Killer Shack, which originally featured 2 window vaults. This created limitless looping opportunities for survivors. Every map had at least one infinite. Trapper, Wraith, and Hillbilly were often powerless to catch survivors in these situations. This could suggest the game's initial focus wasn't on balancing looping, and this feature was more of an emergent style of gameplay. This means when a game features some simple game mechanics as building blocks that, properly combined, provide new degrees of freedom that are left for the player to explore, and the game's design evolved to incorporate it increasingly. The game also launched with a feature known as Kill Your Friends, allowing players to set up custom lobbies to play against each other. It was perhaps from this that during and after the beta testing phase, one feature became heavily requested: Survive with Friends, better known now as SWIF. Shortly after being fully released, the developers got to work. In update 1.0.3, queuing with your friends as Survivor to face off against a random online killer was implemented into the game. This is what makes this topic so interesting. When initially building a game, it is incredibly important to understand what your core foundationary gameplay elements are, and you build upon those. These can sometimes be referred to as pillars, essentially statements which direct your core game design. Early on in Dead by Daylight's lifecycle, the concepts of looping and swiffing were not considered as a core part of the game. In fact, I believe the game was designed to be a solo queue survivor experience when playing that role. I believe the Kill Your Friends mode and initial focus on a solo queue survivor mode may suggest the game was designed to be treated fairly casually. Playing with friends would be contained within a closed lobby, whereas the main game would be a chaotic, horror-fueled solo experience with limited forms of communication. Despite this, BHVR listened to their player base and implemented SWIF, and the game would never be the same again. So what's the big deal, and what makes them so different? Solo queue is exactly what it sounds like. It's to play the survivor role on your own, whereas to SWIF means to play with between 1 to 3 friends, usually with some degree of open mic communication. This allows survivors to share information, such as current generator progress, where the killer is currently located, perks you've discovered the killer has, where a lit totem is situated. You can even better coordinate your actions, such as leading a killer towards a locker for a head-on play, or simply better positioning for a flashlight save. Essentially, SWIF can allow for a huge disparity of information as opposed to the solo queue experience. When playing killer, you can often start to get a sense that you're against a SWIF by the coordination they display in a match, although it's worth noting that not all Survive with Friends lobbies are sweat squads, and some solo queue lobbies are just good at the game. Most people playing with their friends are relaxing and just having fun, but even with that in mind, they still have a lot of informational advantages, making the game much more difficult for the killer role. Even if the survivor team isn't trying that hard to win, they still have the upper hand, an advantage that the game highly struggles to balance around. So this is where a lot of the debate strives from. Ultimately, survivors have the advantage when played optimally in a SWIF. Even playing one of the stronger killers with the strongest perks, you're still going to struggle if the survivors want to win badly enough. So this again leads us to the topic of balance, and the evolution of it within DBD. Now, despite a 4-person Swift using open mics being arguably the strongest form of play, it is widely accepted that solo queue Survivor is actually the weakest way to play, making for quite the disparity. And in between these two widely different forms of play are the blind killers, who are unable to differentiate what kind of lobby they're up against, meaning every team of survivors that outplayed the killer are often assumed to be the optimal Swift. The unfortunate reality of this is that the killers sometimes feel forced to go into each and every match expecting the worst, bringing the most powerful meta perks and camping and tunneling increasingly often. And why do players choose to do this? Well, partially due to MMR. You are going to face teams who match your skill level, and sometimes they're going to win. But whose fault is it when you lose? In these situations, some will utilise critical reflection. To be specific, reflection on action, meaning the retrospective contemplation of practice in order to uncover the knowledge used in a particular situation. By analysing and interpreting the information recalled, the reflective practitioner may speculate how the situation might have been handled differently, and what other knowledge would have been helpful. The trouble is, DBD is often a game where you can blame someone other than yourself. We've all done it, or had a friend do it, or even seen content creators blame everything but themselves. This is because it's easier to blame others. It's more difficult and takes stronger character to reflect on your own mistakes. Survivors often blame their teammates, if not the killer directly, for failings in the match. Sometimes rightfully, other times wrongfully. Killers do the same, and that usually means accusing the survivors of being in a Swift, which is how a killer player often justifies camping, tunneling, and meta, creating the cycle I discussed in our last video. When in actuality, when we play a match of DBD, we continually make mistakes. Many decisions you make are based on assumptions and guesswork. Much of it is a 50-50 coin toss. As for the Swift question, in 2019 statistics were released showing numbers of players in varying party sizes. The vast majority of players back then was solo queue. I find it unlikely much has changed since then. I know that MMR and time of day will sway this, but no matter how you look at it, you're probably facing more solo queue squads than you'd like to think when playing the killer role. I've said this too many times now, but I'll say it one more time as simply as I can. Dead by Daylight is an asymmetrical game which relies heavily on RNG throughout. Balance is a synonym for the word symmetry. Asymmetry is in direct opposition to balance. If you don't win, that's okay, because the game is heavily dependent on RNG factors such as perks, realm, tiles, palettes, items, abilities, and more. And that's before you take into account the uncertainty that each player brings into the match, with different strengths and weaknesses to their gameplay. That's not to argue that some balance is not a good thing. Here are some strong examples of improvements to the game's overall feel. The 1.1.2 toolbox rework was undoubtedly a great change, preventing generators repairing insanely quick, and the 2.1.0 brand new part adjustment as well, removing the instant gen completions. 4.5.0 brought us the new UI update, hook counters for survivors and killer players helping track match progress, even though the game still only recognises kills for the killer's victory state, but that's a topic for another time. The 4.7.0 Objective Obsession rework, making it far less reliable for Swifts to dominate a match, which also included a much overdue nerf to the Huntress Iridescent Hatchet build. These, I would argue, all with the betterment of the game, making it feel fairer. But something major came on the 7th of September 2021, MMR. 5.2.0 reworked the old rank system and it became the current grade system. Matchmaking was now in the hands of MMR. Swiftly following this came 5.3.0 with another much needed nerf to the hatch, making keys take 2.5 seconds to open the hatch, and now it would only spawn when one survivor remained in the realm. 5.7.0 was a big balance change as well, introducing a new Haddonfield map, which beforehand was a widely unpopular map among killer players, also adjusting several perks including Boil Over, Circle of Healing, Sloppy Butcher, and a rework to the Hemorrhage status effect. This led to the most recent big balance patch, 6.1.0. With this we saw a massive meta shakeup, which I would suggest has put Dead by Daylight in the most balanced state it's ever been, but I would also argue in one of the most stale states as well. So this brings us to potentially the next big balance patch being teased. On the 19th of December 2022, BHVR showed us a teaser for a new feature they are looking to add. A user interface update allowing survivors to see which of their teammates is currently being chased, along with what actions survivors are currently doing, including cleansing totems, opening chests, and repairing generators. Currently a PTB is underway which shows the full extent of the UI update. The upcoming informational icons will include when survivors are healing, mending, recovering, blessing totems, opening an exit door, and a couple of killer specific options as well for snapping out of it and waking up. General response has been very positive, as many players are rejoicing at the idea of solo queue, the most difficult way to play, being brought closer to the level of Survive with Friends. As previously stated, Swift gameplay usually utilises open mic communications, giving them the upper hand in terms of information. This UI update would look to bring these two forms of gameplay to a more equal playing field. But myself, in quite the minority, have some concerns. I have discussed extensively at this point what it is I love about Dead by Daylight. My first video on the channel discussed why the game is so great, the most important element for me being uncertainty. These are the unpredictable elements of the game. You don't know which killer you're initially facing, where they are, what perks players have, what realm you're playing on, where the pallets have spawned, vaults, breakable doors, loopable tiles, where the basement is located, hook spawns, and the skill levels of survivors and killers alike, especially in solo queue. All of these elements, in my opinion, make the game great, though admittedly, none of these things benefit game balance. In fact, I would suggest they are all counter to making a balanced competitive game. The new UI reduces this uncertainty factor. You will no longer not know when the killer has dropped a chase, if anyone has stopped what they are doing to go for that unhook, and your teammates are more likely to know you've been pushed off a progressing generator. As mentioned in Chapter 1, Dead by Daylight was never designed with Swift in mind, but with this update the very nature of the game's focus is now looking more towards it. No longer are you a lone survivor in a horror scenario. You'll have more information, you'll be able to react more accordingly to your situations. Spontaneous moments are going to lessen. This is another step towards stale, predictable gameplay in my opinion, but undeniably a step towards greater game balance. So is this what you want? The reason many of us play Dead by Daylight is because it's fun. Win or lose, it's still fun. Until people are no longer playing for fun, instead to win above all else. This is when you start to bring the monotonous gen kicking builds, immediate 3-gen protections, or the gen focused survivor builds. Time for a blunt opinion. If you care about balanced, competitive gameplay, and choose DBD as your canvas to boost your ego, you might just not be that good at competitive video games, and that's okay. But every day you complain about balance in DBD and behaviour listens to you, is another day that you change the nature of this video game. If you truly cared about playing a balanced asymmetrical horror game, you could go play Video Horror Society, an excellently balanced asim horror game. But you don't, because you weren't good enough to win at that game. You came back to DBD, and complain about balance. The Dead by Daylight player base is more competitive than I have ever seen it, but who is to blame?
How did this happen? Who's to blame? Well, certainly there are those who are more responsible than others, and they will be held accountable. But again, truth be told, if you're looking for the guilty, you need only look into a mirror.
As a player base, we don't know what we want. Do we want a fun casual party game set within the horror genre, or a balanced competitive experience? Judging by VHS's player numbers, most people want the former, but far too many also want to consistently win at Mario Party, charades must be treated like a competitive battleground, and DBD is an esport. My point is, and I do hope the new UI updates make the game better, fairer, and more enjoyable for solo queue survivor play. But every step towards balance in Dead by Daylight has, for me, at least in recent history, damaged the uncertainty and overall fun of the core gameplay. Players take the game increasingly seriously, and the game feels ever more stale for it. I mean, what's next? Do we want the maps to be completely static for the sake of balance? No random generator placement, pallets or vault spawns? Should we always want to spawn in the same place? Should map tiles always be the same as well? If we truly want a balanced game, a lot of this RNG needs to go after all. With the new UI, killers are going to want a buff again, and arguably they will need it. We're likely going to see more camping, tunneling, and more use of meta-gen kicking killer perks to combat this survivor buff. In response, we'll likely see more meta survivor perks speeding up those generator repairs. And finally, more people taking the game ever more seriously. But it's more balanced, so behaviour gave us what we wanted, right? And just to be clear, there is nothing wrong with wanting a well-balanced competitive asymmetrical horror game. There just already is one, and you're already not playing it. Anyway, that's just my thoughts. The new UI will hopefully be a good update, but there is a reason I choose to play solo queue survivor over Swifting most of the time. I'm not thrilled at the two playstyles becoming increasingly similar. But what do you think? Am I being pessimistic? Is balance actually a benefit to your playing experience? Or do you think we're losing something each balance focused patch? Either way, thank you for watching and continuing to support the channel. Have an amazing day, and once again, Happy New Year!